Facepalm America, I'm Beowulf Rockland. FacepalmAmerica.com is where you can go for more information about the show, to listen to past episodes, and to connect with us on social media. I don't think I am going to get out of the habit of calling Donald Trump a fascist, because I think people know generally what I mean. I think it is very satisfying also, and it has, I think, some accurate analogs. However, it has been brought to my attention that it is not an entirely accurate thing to say. And I do like to bear down on the accuracy of language, especially as it pertains to the evolution of history and how it plays out. So I'd like to delve into this a little bit, and there is an excellent article on the term fascism and how it is used. It was written, it's almost a year ago now, but it is as evergreen as it could be, especially now that it is 2024, and someone whom I consider, very broadly speaking, again, to be a fascist is likely going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. And the article is, Does Fascism Exist? For nearly a century, Americans have been throwing the term around without agreeing on what it means. It can be found on the website of the New Republic, and the author is Daniel Bessner. He's an associate professor in the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. He's a co-host of the podcast American Prestige and the author of Democracy in Exile, Hans Speer, and The Rise of the Defense Intellectual. And I know he's done a number of collaborations with folks at Chapo Trap House. That's how he first came to my attention. Daniel Bessner, welcome to Facepalm America. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
So I know, again, from my high school, very basic history that, fascism is an Italian term. Where specifically did it come from, and who were the first fascists, and what did that mean to them specifically?
Sure. It had Latin origins, but it becomes popular in the early 1920s with Mussolini's fascist party in Italy. And it essentially had two specific meanings to them. One, it referred to a bundle of rods that was, a bundle. So a bunch of individual things that come together and are stronger when they become one. So you could see the sort of...
A bundle of rods as opposed to a bag of dicks or something like that.
A bundle of rods as opposed to a bag of dicks, which I imagine if they came together, they would also be strong as one. But so the notion that, the collective is formed out of individuals who are stronger as one. And then also it was this notion of sort of beating and hitting that is implied in the term. So it's a show of strength. And I believe that the Fasci or whatever the exact term was, I haven't looked at in a while, but that's basically mostly correct. It was actually used to beat wrongdoers in ancient Rome. So there's that also violent element inherent in the term. So that's what Mussolini was basically saying, is that we're a violent movement that basically comes together when individuals form into one coherent unit. Gotcha.
Okay. And on a practical level, because I'm no expert on Mussolini's reign. What did that mean in terms of how it played out in quote unquote practical politics when it was implemented? What were the fascists saying that they were really doing in Italy, at least at first?
Yeah, violent street gangs that are seeking to organize Italian polity that has been that was disparate. Italy and Germany were both some of the later forming nation states in Europe, and so there was always these big regional divides, as there were in other nation states, but they were acute in Germany as they were acute in other nation states. But it was a little bit later of a process, so perhaps a little more acute. And so the idea was that you would unite Italy into a coherent whole through this fascist movement, which brought a bunch of individuals together into a, again, coherent and powerful and violent whole.
Okay. And really, I guess, as I understand from your article, the way it gets adapted in the United States really has a lot more to do with Italy's association with Germany than it does anything that happened in Italy itself. So, more to the
Right.
point, the question is, how did those two systems differ in terms of the fascism that they projected? And indeed, would you call Germany a fascist state in the strictest sense of the term?
Well, Germany is just much more powerful in a variety of ways. It had a much larger territory. It had a much wider agricultural base. It had a stronger industrial base. So it's just a more powerful movement there. Italy also had major cities, but Germany had like large urban populations going back centuries. And so it's Italy squared or Italy cubed, I would say, in terms of the actual fascist politics. Now, this is a big question about the degree to which, or rather how fascism operated in practice. If you look at historians examining Germany from, the immediate post-World War II period until the 70s, 80s, 90s, there's this notion that it's a very coherent society with a very, top-down view, but a lot of the historiography in the last 30 or plus years has questioned the degree of central control that was actually practiced in Germany, that historians have argued that if you look at how it functioned on the ground, there's actually a lot more room for movement. There was actually a lot less central control than one might have imagined. And it's not the type of, Ned Flanders totalitarian society that one has in the popular imagination, which is not surprising because it's actually difficult to maintain centralized control of a large disparate region, particularly in a pre-digital era where you didn't have surveillance technologies all over the place. So there was actually more freedom for movement. That being said, Germany and Italy both clearly had issues with violent street battles with World War I veterans who were suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and who were very violent. Germany in particular with vicious anti-Semitism, even though that was also prevalent and available in Italy. So that's roughly how I would think about those two states and how they related to one another.
Do I take it from the reference to The Simpsons that you dropped in that last explanation that perhaps a better updating of fascism in America today would be Flanderism?
I think you said it, not me.
Okay, I will add that to my list of Flandersism to my potential list of replacements for fascism.
The Reed Education Center.
I love it. How does this get translated in America? And what and at any time, I think most folks who have a basic knowledge of the era of the 30s and 40s and what led up to and what happened during World War II remember that there was a huge American Nazi rally in
famous Madison Square Garden, right, with the George Washington next the swastika or the picture of Hitler. I forget which, but it's one. Maybe it's both. Yeah. So I mean, that is obviously a disturbing image, and there were obviously people who were connected to the Nazi Party in the United States. It's just the fact of the matter is this was never a major mass movement here. It just wasn't.
Right. No. Yeah. But certainly there have been strains throughout American culture, which I mean they don't come across in that same way, and they certainly don't look the same. But they have they have a lot of racism pure and simple.
But fascism isn't racism. Right. This is the issue, right? Fascism isn't just far right extremism, because then everything is fascism. And then that denudes the term of its specific meaning. Now, what has actually happened in American discourse is that in practice, everything has become fascism, largely because there isn't an actual fascist movement. So it could become a floating signifier. It could be used to basically refer to anything you don't like. And this has actually shifted over time. I mean, if you think about even in our living memory, you remember Jonah Goldberg writing about Islamofascism, right? It was used to Islam.
Believe me.
Would have liberal fascism. It was used to apply to liberalism. Now it's used to apply to Donald Trump, right? So it's a term that moves in various ways, largely, as I argued in the piece and still believe, it's because American fascism was never really a powerful movement that was able to do things like do things like influence elections. Now, this is not to be, I shouldn't be said as saying that American racism or movements like the Ku Klux Klan or et cetera, or even the Silver Shirts, which were more explicitly fascist, weren't able to affect things, but that's just good old American racism, right? That is a long history that precedes fascism, that long history that comes after fascism. And I don't think that referring to it as fascist necessarily helps us understand what is actually happening in a culture steeped in indigenous genocide, chattel slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, systemic and structural racism, et cetera, et cetera.
It almost seems as if it's a deeper problem that deserves a worse name. I mean,
it's also weird, right? Fascism, you think of Nazi Germany, right? And you don't think of Reconstruction when you use the term fascism. So in some sense, it's actually occluding. When you use the term fascism, Americans think about the Nazis, and they think about the Nazis in the late 1930s into the 1940s. They're not thinking about the Reconstruction era in the 1880s and the type of horrible politics of Jim Crow that were instituted throughout the American South after the Compromise of 1877. So in some sense, it could actually occlude the real deep history of the United States by othering something that is actually profoundly American, and that's a virulent racism.
Do you think that the far right in America, whether consciously or unconsciously, learned something from fascism in Germany, in Italy, in the
they learned how to freak out libs. They learned how to freak out liberals.
I suppose so, yes.
They use the slogans and they use the symbology because it's very powerful. And it has a powerful resonance, which is why, early punks used it, right? It's such a taboo breaking thing. But in terms of like social organization and, bringing together a bunch of veterans to come together and challenge the state, I think the structural conditions are such that they can't really replicate the experience of fascist Italy or Nazi Germany in the American context. Do they use the language of fascism? Absolutely, particularly Nazism. And then there's lots of questions about to what degree is Nazism fascism. I think it's fair to say that at this point in history, you don't need to go into like the minutia of the ideologies of the 1930s. It is fair to refer to it as fascism. But, did they create their own mass organization, brown shirts? Were they able to use the political system to have a Hitler appointed, as happened in Germany in January 1933? I think you'd have to be delusional to say yes. Is January 6th the equivalent of taking over the government with Hitler? No, it's only that way if you want to feel like you're living it. I think a lot of it, and I argue, people want to feel like they're living in a momentous historical moment, and people want to feel like they're like part of it, like these this broad sweep of like history in which they're quote unquote resisting #resistance fascism. So it gives political meaning and actually a moment where ordinary people have very little influence on politics. And we could get into this whole thing, but it to me, it exhibits a nostalgia for an age of mass politics that no longer exists, ironically, by claiming that you're fighting fascism.
Yeah. No, and that makes sense from a historical point of view. I'm just wondering, calling a right-winger a fascist has power. I mean, it's a guttural instinct because of the historical echoes that it has. And it's not accurate. I get that. And you could use it in a broad popular sense. And again, it's just kind of as you say in the article, just kind of a highfalutin fuck you. Is there another term that you think could be usefully employed that has that same sort of power to it?
So let's take a step back. Where is this term usually found? Online or at protests, right? So I would say both of those are ineffective ways to affect politics. So it doesn't really matter to me. Mass protests, for a variety of reasons that I've written about, do not have a very influential role to play in contemporary politics for a variety of reasons. Mostly in the last 70 plus years, the state has been insulated from popular pressure due to a variety of moves made by people in power. And then online is basically just like shadow boxing against the wall. So, use fascists. That's between, as I think I've said before, you and your gut. I don't care, but we're not doing politics. Right. You're just, you're operating in two spheres, online and mass protests, that aren't especially important given the particular structural conditions of 2024 America.
it's a toxic pejorative in and of itself, kind of designed to hurt, and it doesn't really have any particular political function. And